Right. You think a protagonist has to be heroic?
Let's talk about that.
So, today, between two students, we're going to discuss the idea of, do you think a protagonist must be heroic? Heroic's definition, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is of or relating to courageous people, or the mythological or legendary figures of antiquity, of relating to, resembling, or suggesting heroes, especially of antiquity, or supremely noble, or self-sacrificing.
Now, we found that definition and we thought that that didn't really work for the purposes that we needed to use it for. So, in our own words, our working definition for heroic for this assignment is going to be relating to acts of courage, strong moral qualities, a benefit to the common good of people, or putting others before yourself. And that's the definition that we're going to work with. If something comes up that we need to change that, we absolutely will.
We will also discuss the ideas of anti-heroes, which are typically central characters in a story, movie, or drama that lacks conventional heroic attributes, like listed in our definition.
So, what is a protagonist to you?
Well, I mean, the easiest answer is probably a main character.
I think from what we looked at, it came down to be the character in a story that the story revolves around and follows. It's the main one.
Essentially so. I agree.
And so, do you think a typical protagonist seems to be heroic in just a general story?
Generally, without going in depth on it, I want to say yes. That I feel like most books you read and stuff, you feel like they have at least heroic traits. You know, they might not be superheroes or they might not be saving somebody's life or something, but they have the attributes to do something well within society margins.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. I especially think that works for our definition that we have. Generally, a protagonist fits into, courageous, strong moral qualities. They want to benefit the common good of people, and they put others before themselves. But the problem we have with that is not every story is typical,
Not all of them.
like we started out with. So, what can we do to better understand different types of literature to make this definition work for the atypical protagonist, or not just the common one, but can we get that definition of heroic to work for every kind of protagonist in a story? And I think a good place to start would be in the reading that we were assigned, reading short stories. In that, it's a short story called Samuel. It's by Grace Paley. And she introduces the main characters that are, quote, afraid of nothing, end quote, page 1231. But if you remember, during that story, she introduces them. They're afraid of nothing. They're just doing a bunch of reckless stuff. They're on a train, and they're jumping up and down. And Samuel ends up falling off and dying and being killed by that train.
Yes.
So even though he is the main character, the protagonist, kind of the story's following, I don't think that he meets the criteria to be a hero for that.
I agree. I also don't think he meets anti-hero limits either, because he's not, while he is a protagonist, he's the central point of the story. It's very quick, I mean, he's there, he's warned not to be jumping around, everybody else is kind of just looking around, let him do whatever, until one man sparks it all and is fed up with it. Hits the brake,
It's
and
that brake line. It's just done.
there's done.
I do agree with that. I think he's more of a flat character. I think even the word
Absolutely.
protagonist might even be a little bit of a stretch for that 2-page short story, because you don't really get any background information on him. There's no development. So
Nothing.
So the word protagonist, who that story follows, kind of applies loosely to me.
Loose protagonist. I agree with that for sure.
In that sense. But I also also think that the way to understand literature can help by looking at different readings and different perspectives. You know, the way we analyze a story.
Every bit of reading is different.
Yeah, the perspective we look at when we read a story. It's kind of the way we want to interpret, the way we interpret that piece of text that we're reading.
I agree, and everybody's interpretation of different stories. Now this one is a little clear cut, being that it's so short, but if we're given a length of a story that allows us to get into more descriptive knowledge and let our minds run and figure out our own thing, you know, we might not have the same eye-to-eye meet, you know? Like if, for The Little Mermaid, for example, in class, you might have said that the prince was the bad guy, the antagonist for bringing on and turning her down, which inevitably led to her death. But you could also say that the mermaid herself was the bad character because she just threw away her family, her normal life and everything for some dude she didn't know that she saved from a boat, you know? Totally different eye levels. I mean, it's just kind of how you read the story and how you interpret it.
Absolutely, and I think that applies to it. Is does a protagonist have to be heroic? Because I think we can both agree that the Little Mermaid was the protagonist in the story.
She was
the story
protagonist.
follows her, but does she meet the criteria to fit our definition of heroic, or do we need to change that? If we think that she's a hero, but she doesn't meet that criteria, does our definition need to be fixed?
Personally, I don't think she's a hero. You know, you can argue that she saved them from drowning, but at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, she drops her family, her total life. She was a princess of the sea. You know? I mean, she drops it all for a dude she didn't know on lust. Clear-cut lust. She didn't ever talk to him, nothing. She just thought he was a good-looking guy and went for it. You know, was fascinated with how people on Earth that walked on Earth lived. And she kind of just threw it all away, and it backfired on her. So I don't see her as a hero.
I completely agree with that. I think that she meets some, like you said, I think she meets some criteria of what our definition is. You know, she showed courage when she saved the prince from drowning, but throughout the story, her attributes don't come up to fit that full definition. She wouldn't strike me as a courageous, strong, moral person. She doesn't want to benefit the common good of people, and she definitely doesn't want to put others before herself.
Yeah, she threw away everybody.
And I think there's an argument that could be made that is a really good example of a protagonist in a story that does not exhibit heroic qualities. But I really want to get a little bit more into the perspective in which we read a story, get into those atypical, you know, not just the general story. So there's several criticisms. This is a quote from the Literary Theory and Critical Perspectives. There are several criticisms to use in which, quote, offer some useful perspectives to consider in your critical thinking and writing about literature, end quote. It's on page 1292. These criticisms, or glosses, like we talk about them in class, they can all come together and provide a different insight into literary works. So if we're looking at different literary works from different perspectives and we kind of get a different meaning out of the same story, do you think that would change our definition of heroic that we have right now?
If we're looking at several different outlooks, criticisms.
If we look at the same story, like if we look at the Little Mermaid, for example, from a formalistic gloss, if we just look at it through who is the author, where is he from, we're going to get a certain meaning about it. But if we look at it a little bit differently from a different perspective, we could get a whole different meaning. So do you think that those different perspectives could affect what our definition of heroic is right now, or do you think that our definition of heroic would stay the same no matter what perspective or meaning that story could have?
I feel like it could possibly vary a little bit, not insanely. Like, for example, if we're looking at it as a formalistic gloss, that's just the general basis of how everything's working, like you said. I feel like our definition fits there. Now, if you go historical, back, I honestly don't know a good time frame for cowboys, but let's say, late 1800s, let's say that they're, or pre, I'm not sure. Let's say that there's bandits terrorizing the town. You know, a cowboy may be seen as heroic in that sense. As to now, we don't see cowboys. So, are we going to deem somebody running around town wielding a 6-shooter as a hero? Now, granted, if they're, I guess that can be formed into something else, as in like robbers and stuff like that, being transformed into just a more modern era of it could be possible. So I feel like our definition will fit and just kind of reform its way through each clause.
I understand that. And back to like what you were saying about cowboys and stuff, I feel like if you have a story about a cowboy, you know, that's run around town with their pistol, just shooting people up, you know, rooting tooting, that story could be focused around a heroic cowboy. And even if they were a hero in that story, would they be considered a hero in today's world? I think is a whole different argument. But I still think that it's kind of about the perspective that you read the story from. But regardless, I think that with that being said, even if you do find a hero in a story, you can read that story from a different perspective or through a different gloss. You can get a different meaning from it that may transform that character from being a hero to not so much, maybe not fitting all of those qualities.
I agree, and I feel like not necessarily a gloss as much, but kind of the background of the author, I feel like might possibly not necessarily change whether the hero is a hero or not, but I definitely feel like it puts forth why the hero is a hero. All right, I believe that brings us to our next point, and how to identify a hero within a story. But first we have to talk about how authors typically write about heroes. As found in technique in writing the short story, authors should keep in mind that, quote, best of all, it is to avoid depicting the hero's state of mind, you ought to try to make it clear from the hero's action, end quote. Assuming that authors follow this guideline, we can infer that the majority of heroes will speak to us about their thoughts, mainly through their actions, which helps us to identify a hero when we see one.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I feel like in a typical story, when somebody's writing about a hero, it's not, oh, he was thinking this, he thought about doing this. I think it shows more, speaks louder to the audience about what that hero does through their actions, the actual things that they do that show us their heroic qualities, instead of just directly telling us that, you know, they're a good person, you know, they want to benefit people.
I agree. I feel like you're not a hero for what you think. You know, if let's take it to a deep, dark tone. You know, this is kind of gruesome, but let's say somebody's contemplating suicide without us knowing. You know, they might drop a subtle hint and we not know about it, and then it could go on and said action could take place, and we could think, oh, well, I thought about helping them, I thought about reaching out to them. That doesn't make us a hero for thinking. If we would have reached out and got help for them and they stayed alive, you know, then we're a hero in possibly their story, you know, in our story. But to be a hero by saying you thought you were going to do something, I just don't believe it's possible.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings up another topic as well that we can get a little bit more into. I think a really good example of that would be the protagonist in Owl Creek Bridge. You know, think of the actual things that he does in that story. He goes there, he tries to burn that stockade down. He gets caught, he gets hung. That's, if you look at it in chronological order, that's what happens in the story. Nothing really heroic about that, nothing really sticking out. But do you think that he could be argued as heroic for that whole, everything that happened? You know, he escaped, he wanted to get back to his family,
Yeah, I see where you're going with it, and I mean, I can see his thoughts of heroism. It's almost like he is a subtle anti-hero, because while he does display like heroic actions or tendencies in his mind, I mean, he was a Confederate supporter, he was a slave owner, Obviously, in today's society, we would deem that as bad. Back then, wasn't really comprehended as such an awful idea. But he was fooled by a Union soldier, and he thought it was a Confederate soldier. So he went on and tried to destroy the bridge, and with that, he got nowhere. Even if it was successful, if you think about it, it was a fight between our own nation. So he's hurting one half of the nation to help the other half, if it was successful. And granted, it wasn't. He found himself about to be hung or hanged, and despite the reality of him being the board kicked out, snapping a neck on the noose, he thought that he had broke the rope, got through, and made it back to his family. All the while, he opened his eyes to find him to his death. So, if we go back to the idea of as a protagonist, a hero, I don't even deem him as a hero, because while he is the protagonist and the main character of the story, he didn't complete any heroic action.
And I think also, though, an argument could be made, since he is, a Confederate, he wants to burn down this bridge. If he had been successful, say the story took a completely different route, if he had been successful instead of failed, I think that he would have been deemed a hero in the Confederacy. Maybe not, a total hero by our definition, but I think that he would have been considered heroic for what he did for the Confederacy. He helped that certain group of people, that society. So in that small subgroup, I can see where he would be labeled a hero, but for our definition, I absolutely agree, it does not fit. And another, all the more because it didn't actually happen, it was all in his head. But I think that brings us to another point, that there's usually not a singular meaning in a text, and we can look at it from different perspectives, and we can do all that, but I think it's very rare that you find a story, or any piece of literature for that matter, that you can point out and say, this is the one meaning of that. And there's actually a quote from How to Read Literature that says, quote, "Literary works may best be seen not as text with a fixed sense, but as matrices capable of generating a whole range of possible meanings," end quote. So without one true meaning in a story, I feel like that's a given. Without one true meaning, do you think it's easier or harder to identify protagonists as heroic? Because I think that gives us kind of a spectrum on where to view these protagonists. And I'm honestly not sure. I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. Do you think there's one true definition of heroic? Like we said, Peyton, if he had succeeded in burning down that bridge in Owl Creek Bridge, he would have been a hero in the southern states. But do you think that our definition fits as a whole, over a whole of literature, to be heroic, including all those different meanings and those different perspectives?
I think our definition fits well on general outlooks. Granted, if we had the Confederate outlook, then possibly he would be deemed as a hero if he had it done. Technically he didn't complete it. Like, as stated in the book, quote, "Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body with a broken neck swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of Owl Creek Bridge," end quote. So technically, we know he died. He was never a hero in any possible way. Now, like you said, if it happened to go the other way, then possibly it could have been, but it didn't. So I feel like a hero is deemed a hero through the reading. Now, I feel as if it doesn't have to be just a protagonist that can be heroic. I feel like there can be other minor characters that can be heroic. If we want to quote, or not quote, if we want to discuss a modern day example, I don't know how big you are into Harry Potter, but I'm a Harry Potter nerd. So I know, obviously Harry Potter's your protagonist. He's a hero. But you also have deemed, I guess you could say they're minor characters, but, well, you have Ron and Hermione, which are also, I feel like, heroes. Now you get into somebody that's even more minor until about the final 2 books and movies. You get Neville, who doesn't really step up till the end. And then he plays one of the biggest roles in fighting off Voldemort and the evil army. So I feel like he shows signs of heroes. So if we were to reverse the question and ask if heroes had to be protagonists, I would definitely say no. I would think that, there can be many heroes in a story. Now if we're discussing protagonist has to be a hero, or if we're discussing, does the protagonist have to be heroic? I don't think so.
As I say, I'm gonna have to agree with you on that one too. I don't think by any means that it's a necessity that a protagonist has to be heroic. I think we see that in The Little Mermaid, in Owl Creek Bridge.
Exactly.
And but what I really want to make sure that our definition for heroic fits as many types of literatures, as many types of viewpoints as we can. And take poetry into example. You could write a poem about somebody that's heroic, that does all these things. They can be the main character, the protagonist in your poem. But I by no means think that's a necessity that your protagonist has to be. And lost where I was going with that. But in short stories or novels, this comes from the importance of a single effect in a prose tale. In short stories or novels, it might take a while for the protagonist to exhibit heroic traits. Whereas, Edgar Allan Poe said, quote, "In the composition of a rhymed poem, not to exceed in length what might be pursued in an hour," end quote, 1097. And I think what he's talking about there is how it's really hard to develop those, whereas Harry Potter took, what was it, 7 books?
7 books.
7 books to develop those characters' heroic qualities. Does our definition still fit for poems where, you should be in and out, according to Edgar Allan Poe, within an hour? Would Neville have been a hero if J.K. Rowling only had an hour to tell her story instead of 7 books to develop that character? I think those heroic qualities come in later. But those definitions for what is heroic, I think, remain unchanged.
I agree.
think our definition stays the same no matter how long, whether you're writing a novel or whether you're telling a story, a 2-page short story. I think you have the same thing to work with, given that we might be a little bit looser with our definition of hero. We might not be as strict on those qualities, given a short page, an hour-long poem or a 2-page short story. But getting back into that, so as stated by Edgar Allan Poe, quote, "In the composition of a rhymed poem, not to exceed in length what might be perused in an hour," end quote, 1097. So he also continues this with, quote, "Within this limit alone can the highest order of true poetry exist," end quote. That's also on page 1097. And I think kind of what he's referring to is where, as a novel is expanded, you have time to develop all of these ideas. Poetry typically is shorter, where they have to get so much more stuff into that shorter novel.
I agree. I feel like a poem packs a punch to it, I feel like it's all these subtle meanings that actually mean one giant thing, and it's in just a couple stanzas. If you think about typical poetry, that's only a couple stanzas. I mean, you have your exceptions, it'll be long ones and whatnot, but usually they're taking this simple idea and making you think all the way through. And then you find out and you're like, whoa, that's what it means. And it's just one big meaning that, like Poe states, shouldn't take that long to read. It should be under an hour. Edgar Allan Poe also states that, quote, "A poem too brief may produce a vivid but never an intense or an enduring impression," end quote, on page 1099. While he says, quote, "Thus a long poem is a paradox, and without unity of impression, the deepest effects cannot be brought about," end quote, on page 1098. So I feel like Poe is stating that a poem almost has a perfect length. One too long is bad, and one too short isn't enough. You know, I feel like you need to find that certain margin. When discussing poetry, I feel like there's, that just good rhyme about age to keep the reader enthused in what's going on and wondering without dragging it out too long.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of ties a little bit back into where he says, without unity of impression, the deepest effects cannot be brought out. I think that kind of ties back into what we were talking about with, J.K. Rowling developing those characters. Some of those characters didn't show heroic traits until the very end. Whereas, he's recognizing that in poetry, with that typically shorter workspace, if that's what you want to call it, you don't really have time to bring about those, big reveals, those big dynamic character changes into heroic qualities. And so I feel like that because of that and because of him recognizing that, we absolutely do not have to change what we have as our definition of heroic, just to recognize that other form of literature.
I agree. I mean, as of so far through our podcast today, I feel as if our definition still sticks true into covering through short stories and novels, poetry, on deeming what our hero is to a story and what they put forth.
Absolutely, I do too. So I think that let's go over our definition one more time. So we said it at the beginning, and we went through, read through different perspectives. Does the length of a story have anything to do with, changing our definition? But back to our actual definition, we said is relating to acts of courage, strong moral qualities, of benefit to the common good of people, or putting others before yourself. And I think that separately, each one of those is a necessary quality to be considered heroic. And I do not think that a protagonist has to represent every single one of those qualities by any means throughout a story.
I agree. For sure. Which is common in a lot of our short stories. We don't see a lot of this character development and seeing an actual true hero based on our definition.
So talking about our short stories, a great example I think is The Story of an Hour, which begins with the protagonist, Miss Mallard. She's the one that the story is following. She's the one that the story it's kind of focused on her. So she's definitely the protagonist. But I think she's a prime example of a protagonist that is not considered heroic, at least by our definition. And from what we've read and discussed so far, I think our definition stands true. But she receives news of her husband's death. She goes to reflect alone, and she realizes then that without her husband, she's free to live her life. She even goes upstairs and, she mutters, quote, free, 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 to herself. And that's on page 231. She becomes happier and happier until her husband walks through the front door, and he was never dead. He was far away for work. He didn't even know there was an accident. And she immediately dies of a heart attack. And not because she's so happy to see him or anything like that. She's upset. She dies of a heart attack because she thought she was going to have this, great life. She was going to be by herself. She was free to do whatever she wanted. She wasn't, trapped in that marriage at this point anymore. And I don't think anything in that story that we've read so far represents any qualities that we have in our definition of heroic.
I agree. Even before we started conversing on this topic, I would feel, if I was just asked, is Mrs. Mallard a hero in the story? I would immediately say no. I mean, also, if you want to look at it, we're not given much character development on this either, not much background, because we just know she's at her house and we find out, or supposed that her husband had died in a train wreck. Or in a train explosion accident. And so she goes up, like you said, and is in her room. She starts looking outside, seeing the sky and everything, finding everything beautiful, and then realizes her freedom. And basically is happy upon her husband's death, which I don't see that as very heroic, especially somebody you're supposed to be, in love with or whatnot. Obviously, I mean, we don't understand from the story if the marriage had issues or what the issues were, but she doesn't show a sense of heroism throughout the story at all. And then the book or the short story ends with a quick ending of her death when her husband's actually there.
For sure, I agree with that 100%. So I think we're both kind of on the same page that a protagonist in a story by no means has to be heroic at all. And there's tons of examples of that we've read in class. But I feel like there's also a ton of examples in a modern day where we see stories about people who are not, your typical hero. They don't have heroic qualities. I think a great example is Breaking Bad. And
Great show.
yeah, and he starts off, Walter White, and he is just a normal, he's a high school teacher, and he gets diagnosed with cancer, and he gets a death sentence. So I think to him, throughout that entire series, it develops him transforming into a completely different person, Heisenberg, as he calls himself when he's making the meth or whatever. And so I think you see that transformation throughout the entire series, from him going to normal, not even heroic in the beginning, I would say, but just normal, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad. He's just a high school teacher. He has a wife, he has a kid, and you see this slow transformation into just the absolute best example of an anti-hero that I can think of in today's society, in something modern.
Absolutely. And I really think he fits the anti-hero idea on the fact that ideally, he shows his traits there, and if he, originally he was doing it for a cancer so he could live, find a cure and whatnot, or be good. But once they find out he's in remission and he's got 2 years extended, he continues to produce the drugs and make millions. So that I don't see as a heroic idea. That's dirty money. It's
Absolutely. I don't think he fits really any of those qualities. He might show courage. He probably does show courage a couple times that I'm just not remembering specific incidents throughout the show. I guarantee there's something he does that is courageous. But like we talked about earlier, I think you need to meet independently every single one of those qualities.
Exactly.
Our definition of heroic.
even the biggest villain could be courageous at some points.
And he's not trying to do anything for the benefit of society. He's not trying to not trying to put other people before himself at any point, really. Especially more towards the end, he doesn't really have a lot of redeeming qualities. He turns into that just bad person. No really heroic qualities at all.
I agree. Another common example, or I think a really good example, again bringing out my nerd qualities, in the Harry Potter fandom here, Severus Snape. At least in my eyes, one of the greatest anti-heroes ever. You go through, whether you're a book or movie person, you go through the whole, I think, probably first 7 movies. I think it happens in the first half of the Deathly Hallows. First or second, I can't remember. But you go through, and he's just straight gruesome, Harry. He doesn't really look out for him unless it's going to be on his death, even Snape was a Death Eater, or he was part of the Dark Army. He never really cared for Harry. You could see his resentment towards him and everything. And then you later find out that Snape had been doing this all along for Harry, setting all this up so Harry would be safe, because even kick it back farther, Snape was in love with Harry's mom way before and was turned down by her for Harry's dad. So Snape's real resentment was always towards Harry's father, and it kind of carried on to Harry because Harry was a constant reminder that he lost Lily to James.
So do you think that, obviously, he comes back and he redeems himself. If you haven't seen everything or you haven't read all the books, once you get up to that, like book 6, book 7 even maybe, he has no heroic qualities at all. And then right at the end, you just get hit with everything. All those reasons past that change everything that he's ever done. And in your opinion, do you think that that makes him a hero? Do you think that that changes who his character was to make him fit the heroic qualities that we have, is our definition?
Absolutely. I mean, you go through the whole time and you're like, dang, Snape's this awful guy. And he's terrible, you know. He's the Half-Blood Prince, you know. Like, all this stuff is just, this is the evil guy. And then you're just like, oh, he's good. He's been doing this the whole time. You know, like, it's, honestly, it's a big, like, heartwarming feeling because you're just like, that's, like, the most sincere thing. Because, I mean, in Harry Potter, you don't really see a lot of sincerity. I mean, here and there, you know, Dumbledore looking out for Harry, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But that is, like, the biggest character swap, you know, because he literally goes, like you said, from this mean man that, I mean, even the other students at Hogwarts didn't really care for. I mean, even in his house, Slytherin, I mean, he got on to Malfoy too. He wasn't really a fan. And, I mean, Snape worked with Lucius and was a Death Eater with Lucius, which is Malfoy's father. So you kind of just see, like, he's bad. And even him being in the Slytherin house, which isn't deemed as bad, but it's Gryffindor's rival, which Harry and his buddies are part of Gryffindor. So they're automatically like an enemy, and Snape's the head of the house at the time. So it's kind of like, this guy's bad from the start. You know, he's always going to be a problem, and then it just flips. And it's like one of the biggest twists, I think, in
absolutely. That's one of my
books and
favorite
movies
parts in the entire series. I love that, and I love that. But I love that switch. But also, I think that shows how important what type of narration you have in a story, what kind of role that can play. You know, we didn't know that until the very end. You know, had Harry Potter had, you know, an omniscient narrator, where we had known everything,
the whole
known all information to us at all the time, I think he would have been a heroic character, and I think that we would have seen past what he's doing to see the deeper meaning behind as heroic, as our interpretation.
It would definitely be crazy to see in the minds of everybody in Harry Potter.
Absolutely. But another thing is, while we're on the topic of narrators, first-person narrators, and that when we read the elements of fiction, it kind of goes into some depth on first-person narrators. You can't really trust them. I think there's an argument to be made that first-person narrators, being human, always are going to have subjective qualities. They're always going to look into their own viewpoints. And actually, I have a quote from Dr. Sarah Eastland.
Heard she's famous.
She is. Very famous. I hope I get to meet her one day. We should have her on the show.
We should. You know what I'm saying?
That's a great idea.
I actually have an appointment to meet with her next Monday.
Wow.
Right?
Get an autograph for me.
I will.
But, quote from Dr. Sarah Eastland, quote, "Every single person in this room is the hero of their own life. You are not." End quote. That was from January 31st, 2020.
So you're telling me I'm not a hero in your life?
You are the hero in your own life. It's that first-person narrator. You're seeing everything from your point of view, from your subjective point of view, which is different than mine, which is different than everybody else's. And your subjective point of view, you're the hero in your own life. I am a minor character. You know, I could transfer schools, and we could never see each other again. And that would just be one part of your story.
Maybe a chapter.
Absolutely. But I think that kind of rings true for all first-person narrators, no matter what really the form is. I think there's an argument to be made that you can't trust them. There's not really a lot you can do.
I agree. I mean, it's kind of just their word and how it goes. I mean, I can tell you, I saved 30 people's lives, and it might have just been that I didn't drive my car that day, I didn't cause a wreck, you know? But I could have not told you that, so you might think I'm a hero, but this is my story, you know? It's my outlook.
Absolutely.
What I think, you know?
And
And we're all minor characters. You're a minor character in my life, they're a minor character in my life. I mean, like Dr. Easton said in class, walk out, look around. Every person you cross, you're a minor character in their life. You're not the hero, they are.
And I think again, I hate to bring up Owl Creek so many times, but I think that narration coming from Peyton, all from his point of view, what was happening. You know, you look at those things outside of his perspective at what's actually happening. He tried to burn down a stockade. He got hung.
Arson.
Yeah. But you look at it from his point of view, and it's this whole awesome story with a twist ending. That changes everything. But actually, there's a quote from The Elements of Fiction that I wanted to bring up. And as we read it, the first person narrator is, quote, making us aware as we read his or her story that the account is skewed and that we can't quite trust the point of view, end quote. And I completely agree with that. I think that as a first person narrator, there's always a possibility that we might not even be able to see as a reader, but that we have to at least recognize that it's there. So I think the big question for us is, can you have a heroic protagonist that is written in first person, from the point of view from that heroic protagonist?
That's a tough question because, I mean, you want to say yes, you want to believe so, but can you really trust him is the thing, you know, like you don't know what's actually happening. I feel like a good example of that is, I think you were telling me about it, one of your favorite movies, Fight Club. Great movie.
Yeah, I really do like that. And I think you see that as, you know, it's told from first person, so you don't really understand. It's not an omniscient, you know, narrator. It's all from the point of view of the main character. And he meets Tyler Durden. And, you know, Tyler Durden is just this bad dude, but he is cool. He does everything that the main character wants to do. And, you know, there's all these terrible things as well. You know, things that, you know, people might think about but not really act on. But Tyler Durden is not that person. He is the person that does it. He does what he wants to do. He doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't care who it hurts.
Definitely not a hero.
No, definitely not. But then at the end, you find out that your main character made up Tyler Durden in his head. That he has actually been Tyler Durden this entire time.
So you'd say he was the one in charge with vandalizing and terrorizing pretty much everything?
And that's a whole big thing at the end, you know, kind of the...
Flashbacks?
Yeah, it shows that all those flashbacks of, you know, him recognizing that he's been Tyler Durden this entire time and that he's been the one doing this. And it changes everything. This person goes from being a main character to just extreme development. You combine two characters into one at the very last part of your story. And I think it mixes those heroic qualities together and also the bad anti-hero qualities.
Almost the perfect anti-hero.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, you go through, I feel like that's a crazy plot twist too. You go through the whole story thinking, or the whole movie thinking that, man, he's just trying to fit in, he's just trying to be cool, you know, this is the cool thing to do. Then you find out this has all been made up. Kind of like at Owl Creek Bridge, his vision, you know, this has all been fake. And he's actually the bad guy. He's been an anti-hero the whole time, which I think is a prime example of a protagonist not having to be heroic.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. And I also think that comes back to how the narration style can affect what's going on in the story. It completely changes everything. You know, from first person, I would say that I don't think we can have a protagonist that is a definite hero if it's written in the first person from the perspective of the hero. I think that we always have to recognize that that's their subjective thoughts from the narrator that's changing, warping the information that we're getting. So I don't think
definitely bias for sure.
Absolutely, and I think that even if we do find a story that, you know, oh, it's written in the first person, it's from the point of view of the hero, they represent every quality in our definition, I think that narration style is an argument in of its own to where it does not fit heroic qualities. I think that even if we did find the perfect hero like that, just written in first person, it could absolutely be argued that they're not heroic.
Yeah, because I mean, what they think could be heroic, you know, a minor character in the story might think this dude's a lunatic. You know,
absolutely.
I mean, they could not be a hero in their eyes at all, and it's just their biased view that they think they're helping everybody.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. But I think that leads us into our
Wait. Much better.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that leads us into our next point. We read Prisoner on the Hell Planet in class, and I think that's a perfect example of a first-person narrator. And when we read that story, we really had a lot of questions still at the end. There were some things that didn't have clear-cut answers. And I think the reason for that is because it was a first-person narrator. And, kind of a prime example of that, he says, quote, "I felt confused, I felt angry, I felt numb," end quote. That's on page 873.
We see the eyes, so we know for a fact it's first person narration.
For sure. And he's actually telling the audience at that point what his emotions were. And I think that even shows further how much more subjective the information that we were getting throughout that whole story was. He's going through a lot. He's obviously not in a good state of mind at all throughout that story.
Yeah, and in the beginning we find out that he was just got out of the mental hospital.
Yeah.
So we know there's some pieces of the puzzle that are a little discombobulated there.
For sure. And I think that's a perfect example of a first-person narrator giving us warped information, whereas if we had a third-person omniscient narrator,
Yeah.
I don't think that story would have been the same at all.
Because we have no clue what he's saying is true or not. And despite the title being Prisoner, we don't, in the graphic images we see, it seems as if it's an actual prison, but after you and I, we kind of did some research ourselves and kind of looked at it and looked into some theories and stuff, and it seems more so that it's kind of Nazi related, back to the Holocaust.
For sure.
And talking about his parents are Holocaust survivors, and though he didn't experience it, he might have felt those hardships through that, and he kind of just felt like a letdown all the way through. And through the novel, we see like he says his mother, or he kind of just pushes her away when she says she like loves him and stuff, and I guess he just kind of resented towards that. And then we see that whenever he starts crying after he finds out that she is dead, that the doctor, first off, in the picture, we kind of looks strikingly resemblance to Hitler.
Oh, for sure.
And we see that he's like, cry, you should cry now, because you didn't cry before and all this. Like, you didn't have any feelings towards her before. And it kind of looks more so that when you think about it in that way, that the outfit that he's wearing looks more like Jews. And during the Holocaust, there's stripes. And the book actually quotes, quote, "Hitler did it," end quote. So I feel like that's a direct, like, whoa, this is about the Holocaust. This isn't prison. And it's more of a mental prison on him, that he feels like he is in these places. And then he says stuff about his mom. Congratulations, she committed the perfect crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really ties back into the narration style, where we had to do research.
Mm-hmm.
We had to kind of talk about it, discuss it, look some things up to understand that was really a story about the Holocaust, all those influence that it has from the Holocaust into it. And I think with a different narration style, we definitely would have seen that. But I think another story that has a really interesting narration style is A Rose for Emily that we read in class as well. And we actually have a quote from Isaac Rodman. It says, quote, "The narrative weave contains two voices, that of a surface narrator who accurately portrays the voice of the town, and that of a deeper narrator who conceals his judgments but allows his tone to indicate his perspective to literary inclined readers." The deeper narrative implies Faulknerian isolation on the part of the narrator who speaks as the voice of the town, end quote. That's on page 4. And with that insight, I think it's really interesting with, bringing up a deeper narrator.
Kind of makes the reader think about it more.
Yeah.
You see like what he's telling us is going on, and we see that she's like buying poison and whatnot, but we don't know what exactly. Like, we can assume what's happening, but we don't know until the end. So it's kind of like that second narrator is kind of making us think, like it says, inclined readers, wants us to like start thinking more in like literature, fiction type deal, to think like, oh, what could this really mean? Using skills of foreshadowing and things like how can this be an influence to what's going to happen? You know.
Absolutely. But I mean, while we're on A Rose for Emily, I didn't view her as heroic anywhere
By any
throughout that
means,
story. Yeah,
no.
not even close. And she's definitely the protagonist. You know, the story revolves around her. The
She
title
moves the
is A
story.
Rose for Emily. Yeah, absolutely.
She's the whole moving point
Yeah.
of the story. Excuse me. And I mean, we find out she committed a murder. You know, she poisoned the man and laid in bed with him. Possibly committed necrophilia. Like,
Well, actually, while we're on that subject, we have a quote from that as well. Quote, one of us lifted something from it. They're talking about the pillow at this point. And leaned forward. That a faint and invisible, dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair. End quote. That's on page 320. And they're talking about after they find his body in there, in the bed, after they're talking about how it looked like somebody had been laying next to him, he'd been there for a while.
Yeah.
They found a strand of her hair.
Once we get to the turning point, we actually have access into her house. Then we see like how everything had just been left. You know, like dust on all the appliances, on the rooms, just everything. It's just kind of been almost as if she was dead inside before she was actually dead.
Absolutely.
And then we got to find out that she's even less heroic than, that you could even think of, being that, she killed a man and committed necrophilia, which is not deemed a societal good at all.
No, not at all. And I don't think anything she does throughout that whole story applies to anything in our definition that we have for heroic. But while we're on that, I think a really interesting, something that may be considered heroic, is the main character from the story, where are you going, where have you been?
Definitely arguable.
And I think that's because Connie, at the end of that story, she goes with Arnold. And I think that could be seen as kind of maybe heroic, because he's threatening her family. She doesn't know what's going to happen to her, so she's sacrificing something for herself. She's definitely being courageous, maybe stupid a little bit, but the courage is definitely a part of that. To go with him in order to, upon his word, as far as she knows, save her family.
I thought that that short story was kind of crazy. It takes a crazy turn point. Insane foreshadowing. Arnold literally says, "I'm gonna get you." You know, he's out to get her, and then he shows up at her door, and then just the verbal threats start happening. Like we found within the short story, quote, "This is how it is, honey. You come out and we'll drive away. Have a nice ride. But if you don't come out, we're going to wait till your people come home, and then they're all going to get it." End quote. That was found on page 692. So that's a verbal threat. He's saying, you can either come with me and we'll go on our ride, or I'm going to hurt your family, and you all are going to feel the pain, you know. But, kind of throwing it back to how we were talking about narration, we see this from her point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't see anything into his mind. We don't know what his intentions are whatsoever.
True. He could be a great guy trying to take her on a date, just in a really peculiar way, you know?
Yeah, something's definitely up with him, but I think we're not clear whether his intentions are to hurt her, to do anything like that. And if we had a different narration style that maybe let us see into that, it's a complete possibility that what we understand is maybe heroic for Connie would not be. Maybe, if he doesn't have any bad intentions toward her at all, then she's not doing anything heroic. You know?
I agree. I feel that's where the argument can come into play. Is she heroic for going with him? We don't know, because the story ends abrupt, or abruptly. We don't know what actually happens. Is she murdered? Is she raped? Is she go on a date and brought back home? Does he come back after killing her and kill her whole family? We don't know anything that happens. So is it really a heroic deed by what we can read? Who knows?
Absolutely. And back to our question as a whole, does a protagonist have to be heroic? Absolutely not. By any means, I don't think so. And even if we said, hey, a protagonist does have to have some heroic qualities, and let's argue about it, I think that we would definitely have a strong argument against that, just based on narration style.
I agree, absolutely.
And I think I think that even if somebody did believe that a protagonist had to be heroic, there's too many examples out there that we've just talked about, just in this class, just movies that we've watched on our own before even talking about this subject, TV shows.
Even going outside of our definition, there's several modern conceptions of what a hero has to be or what a hero is, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, Teen Van Oslier, quote, heroes have been described by various definitions. They have been depicted as men of superhuman strength, the chief male characters of an epic, and of representation as virtues and role models, worthy of veneration and imitation, end quote, on page 150. So that would be kind of tying into, well, is a hero have to be somebody of power? Do they have to have superpowers or some kind of imbalance here, you know?
And I think, I don't think a hero, bringing that question up, I don't think a hero does have to be somebody in power per se. I think that the movie Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, I think that's a great example.
Great movie as well.
I feel like throughout that story, it's more of a man versus self type of story. There's not really any big person trying to stop him from doing what he wants to do. He just has to do it on his own.
Yeah, overcome his own issues.
But I love that movie. I viewed that as heroic, in my opinion. He's sacrificing so much to do something for his son. He's showing so much courage by going in there homeless and applying for this big time job at a corporation, and I love that. I view him as a hero personally, but
I agree. Even if you want to think of it as a different genre we haven't really talked about, if you want to take into more of a nonfiction base and think about war movies or even just war heroes in real life, I mean, people are going to deem certain saviors heroes, you know, somebody who completes an action to save many others is a hero, but he doesn't have any superpower, he can't fly, he doesn't have super strength, you know. So I mean, it kind of goes on the definition you go by, which.
But I think the difference between like real life heroes and a hero in a story, I think there is a big difference in that. Whereas we look as heroes as somebody we look up to, somebody that does something that saves a bunch of people. I think a hero in a story has a little bit more of a clear cut definition, and I think that's where ours plays a huge role in this argument. We actually have a quote from David Robson. It says, quote, fictional heroes should represent the most effective survival strategies, while the villain should be a clever manifestation of real dangers we can face, end quote. It's on page 610. And I think that's a little bit different of a viewpoint than what we've talked about so far. He's saying how authors should write about heroes, what makes a hero more likable to an audience, and he's saying that they should represent effective survival strategies, which I think kind of ties into people need to view them as strong, which I disagree with. I don't think that's really in our definition, even for fiction, really any story at all. I don't think your hero has to be some big, strong person that's saving all these people or anything like that.
I agree. I like to think about that quote there. I feel like a good outlook on that is maybe possibly it states survival strategies, but more so kind of blending our definition with that, like the moral characteristics. I feel like that fits well in our definition, but I could see where he says villains should be clever manifestations of the real dangers. I feel like that is a whole nother outlook, because kind of how we talk in class about man versus self, man versus man, etc. I feel like a villain doesn't have to be one specific thing. It can be something, just a hardship in our life that we have to overcome. Kind of throwing it back how we talked about previously, that we're the hero in our own lives. I feel like those villains could be just problems you're overcoming, whether it's a family death, in a sports outlook, maybe getting to a starting position, stuff like that. That's doesn't have to be a person. It's just something that you have to overcome these hardships to get to your, where you want to be in life,
Absolutely. And I think that real life example is a great way of looking at it, because I think literature as a whole, it's just authors writing what they're thinking. It's stories that they're coming up with, basing that off, their life, somebody else's life, a different story that they've heard before. And we have all these different types of thoughts about, what is a hero, what is a villain. And I think it's impossible to say that a protagonist has to be heroic in some sort of literature, especially when you can consider so many different things heroic or villainous, or when you have so many types of literature that kind of expand that definition beyond even what we're thinking of right now.
I agree, and I feel like there's both real life literature and modern pop culture examples. I mean, just the few that we went through, we see theirs, and I mean, there's list on possible protagonists that aren't heroic. That I don't think you have to be like kind of like how we talked in class. The protagonist is the moving character. He doesn't have to be good or bad. Therefore, I don't believe that he has to be a hero.
Absolutely, and I think we've shown a ton of definitions, like you said, a ton of examples, like you said, in modern culture, whether it be TV shows, movies we've watched, or even the stories that we've read in class. I think there's too many examples for anyone to ever say a protagonist does have to be heroic.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in your opinion, do you think our definition of heroism fits?
I do. I really like our definition.
That, and as a group together, do you feel like we can agree? Have we come to conclusion?
100%. I feel like, for me at least, I don't want to speak for you, but I just want to read over our definition of heroic one more time. We have relating to acts of courage, strong moral qualities, of benefit to the common good of people, or putting others before yourself. And I think we both agree that we like that definition. That definition holds up for us. But for me personally, I am a hard no. A protagonist does not have to be heroic.
I'd have to agree I'd have to agree with you there. I don't think in any way, shape, or form they have to be heroic.
Absolutely. So I guess that settles
I guess
it.
that's it.
We'll catch you all back on our next episode of Between Two Students.